So welcome, everyone, to the discussion today. I think first and forefront on our minds is the conversation in Duchenne has certainly progressed with the advancements in research, and we are now at the forefront of discussions. Industry is having discussions, biotech is having discussions with FDA, and I think sometimes we hear little bits and pieces without trying to understand the framework of the FDA, how it operates, and the laws that govern it. So today, we're lucky to have Dr. Tim Franson with us. Dr. Franson is with Faegre B&D. You might probably be well aware that Dr. Franson is with the consulting firm that we are using with regard to our advocacy agenda in Washington, D.C. So with that being said, I would like to welcome Dr. Franson and ask that he get started.
Great. Pat, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some perspectives on FDA and the User Fee Act and how all of this complex process can really be understood and simplified. As a background, I am a physician and a pharmacist, but I'm also a parent, and I understand the importance of these kind of proceedings to any parent as new potential cures come forward for your children. So I've had the pleasure of working with PPMD over the last 6 months or so on a variety of initiatives, and further interactions with the FDA and understanding their processes is an important part of that. Today's session is intended as a means to better understand what some of the processes are at FDA for how they look at new medications overall and for rare diseases. And then how does one use that information as a foundation for advocacy? Because we're at an unusual window of time. This is the year when the User Fee Act for prescription drugs is renewed, and this happens only every 5 years, so more frequently than Halley's Comet, but not on an annual basis. And I would take this opportunity to also applaud Pat and the PPMD board for a leadership role in developing a policy statement about how one should actively engage in the development and approval of the experimental therapies being considered in DMD. And I think you'll hear more about that in the coming days, but I would use that as a reference point as you think about what we discuss today, understanding the groundwork of how the process is currently constructed, and then how one might be able to offer input as this User Fee Act is further modified to help access to new treatments, to enable the use of new tools for things such as functional status, boys living with Duchenne, and other modified or accelerated approval processes. So the hope of all this is that it will be important for us to appreciate what can be changed and then how one might proceed with that. So given that, what I propose to do here is to talk about several topics. So what is that background, first? And then second, what is changing atop the background? Third, so where do we stand today? Fourth, what impedes progress? And then fifth, and most importantly, what are the ways forward in terms of changing, modifying FDA processes for the betterment of children and parents? So you see a weather map there before you, and I don't put that there just because it's nice and colorful, although that storm over the Midwest is probably very accurate today, but it reflects that regulatory environments are very much like climates. They're somewhat unpredictable, but there are patterns and that there are trends and that there are certain rules. We usually don't see snow in July in America and so forth. And as a result, I think understanding what some of those givens are help us better frame how advocacy may proceed forward. As we move ahead then, let's talk about some of the terminology, and I'll go through some of the basic process and rules that FDA uses for approval of new drugs. They also oversee many other things such as foods, their importation of medications and foods and so forth. I've used the acronym PDUFA already, and it stands for the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which was new legislation as of 1992 and renewed every 5 years thereafter. So this is now the fifth iteration of the process. But I might suggest to you that you could think of PDUFA as an acronym for something different, and that is Parents Desire Understanding of FDA Actions. Just happens to be convenient letters, but it does inspire the notion of being able to understand and manage the process. Part of that process is significant in terms of understanding how FDA looks at matters in terms of safety versus risk. You might say, isn't that kind of the same? And to some parties it may be. In a regulated environment, it's quite different. And so I will talk about that difference. Also about benefit risk, which in one sense is what happens at the bedside or as one is visiting a physician. You always like to hear about why would you want me to take this medicine and what are some of the risks of it. Those same kind of considerations go into the approval of new drugs. And we're going to be talking primarily about drugs that are approved at the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. There are numerous other things, and I won't belabor any of those points, but we'll focus on the things of greatest concern to the DMD community. And then talking a little bit about what exactly is the drug development process going forward. So as one looks at the next step in that sequence, the concern, I advanced too rapidly. So what exactly is FDA's mission and their responsibilities regarding drug development? First, it's to protect the public from unsafe events that may arise as a result of use of foods, medications, dietary supplements, and so forth. Second, to promote the public health, which implies that they have a role in facilitating drug development if at all possible. And then to comply with the laws, the rules, and the regulations that oversee how FDA is to function. And that little graphic there is a recent publication from FDA called Driving Biomedical Innovation, where they acknowledge the importance of their involvement in this process. So if one then says, what exactly is drug regulation and how did it come to be? The first FDA, or Pure Food and Drug Act, was passed by Congress in 1906. And since then, almost every modification to those basic laws occurred as a result of a public crisis. So in 1938, a major amendment to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act occurred as a result of a very tragic event when elixir of sulfanilamide, which was an anti-infective type compound, was suspended in a vehicle to dissolve it that ended up in killing over 100 children. Very tragic. And as a result of that, significant safety provisions were added in FDA legislation. And then further, in 1962, another major legislative revision called the Kefauver Amendment or Kefauver-Harris Amendment occurred when the drug thalidomide was not sufficiently tested by today's standards and resulted in short limbs in children at birth, which was a very visible complication. Interestingly, the next step then, now that you have safety and effectiveness as important components of this process, in 1992, atop that, occurred the first Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or PDUFA. That was probably in part related to the AIDS crisis and the fact that at that point in time, from the studies for a new drug candidate to be submitted to FDA and then processed and approved was taking over 3 and sometimes up to 5 years. Pretty dramatic delays when you think about the importance of new drugs to patients waiting and having unmet needs, not dissimilar from the kind of unmet needs that we're talking about with your children. And then every 5 years since 1992, there has been a renewal of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act with modifications. And that last part is very important when one thinks of advocacy opportunities. As a result of the last PDUFA renewal, the so-called FDA Amendments Act of 2007, because of the recent, at that point, safety issues with a number of compounds, and you may remember Vioxx and Avandia and so forth, which were quite visible in the press, significant new safety requirements and significant new powers were granted to FDA at that point in time. So as one looks at what does that all mean, there are a number of laws and regulations and guidances, which are kind of descending tiers of detail that dictate how FDA and how industry must interact in new drug development. I'm not going to go through all those. The last time I did that with an audience, had many people fall asleep, and I had to provide pillows to keep folks from breaking their noses. So we will keep it to the key points, which is before 1992, it took way too long to have the NDA review process occur, and new drugs reviewed until that point were funded only by appropriations from Congress. So PDUFA was a landmark in terms of both the funding of applications and the timeliness. This provision made clear that sponsor companies such as big and small pharma would pay fees to FDA. Those fees could be then used by FDA to hire staff so that timely reviews could be done. It did not guarantee approvals, so you can almost think of it as like paying for your driver's license test. You get the opportunity to pass or not. Now, the fees are much more significant here, but still quite analogous. So with that as a foundation for how drug development is guided by the boundaries, if you will, drug development and its approval overall is and should be driven by patient unmet needs. And these rules framing FDA decisions undergo frequent updates, and as I've already cited, are frequently influenced by public crises. They are also, in effect, things that are looked at as precedents. Being a legalistic type system, folks look at what's been done in the past and believe that to be probably acceptable unless additional evidence is brought forward. PDUFA is an example of times when new evidence is welcomed. Now, since 1992, Congress has seen fit to have appropriations shrink while industry pays more and more of these user fees. That's led to a concern in the newspapers and in critics that you may have read about this constituting a conflict. But I just want to reassure you, having already mentioned the criteria by which this occurs, a sponsor may pay for their NDA application to be reviewed, and it can be declined. And that assures the integrity of the process, and FDA doesn't get more or less money by virtue of approving or not approving a drug. So with that in mind, what can I tell you about PDUFA beginning in 1992 and progressing forward to today when PDUFA-V is right before us, and significantly, PDUFA-V proposals having provisions for the rare diseases community. So in PDUFA-I, there was a modest, by government standards, 5-year industry fees of $339 million. And in terms of what that provided, you see in the middle column there of yield, it was to give a predictable review cycle. So folks would get an answer at 12 months. It may not be a happy answer to the drug company, but they knew that they would get the answer. And this did lead to a significantly reduced time to approval because FDA had more scientists and support staff. 5 years later, the PDUFA-II was renewed with the endorsement of industry, FDA, and Congress enthusiastically because clearly the flow of new drug approvals had increased and had a significant positive impact on public health. that also included some additional technical provisions, but in essence, it was to renew what had already been a winning program. In PDUFA-III, 5 years later, beginning in 2002, the fees, again, more than doubled. So it's now at $1.2 billion paid through industry to the FDA over that 5-year span. And that then provided FDA more money to improve their processes and to focus more on safety matters. And finally, PDUFA-IV, which was enacted in 2007, was again about another doubling in fees, so close to $2.4 billion, which then radically expanded the oversight of safety matters, which we can talk about in a moment. So FDA's authorities, in comparison to what had happened in the prior PDUFAs, were significant. In fact, as you see in the green bar there at the bottom of the slide, the PDUFA-IV, or FDA Amendments Act, as it's also called, was the largest expansion of FDA power since the Kefauver Amendment of 1962. And that has provided a huge focus on drug safety. I'll mention why FDA has done this, but it's sufficient to say that is where the funding was devoted, and FDA had much more powers than to compel the drug industry to do more and better drug safety studies after approval, and also to change labels to the benefit of the patients and prescribers who need the best information to appropriately use these drugs. So, juxtaposed with that is how does an industry company navigate this process? And it is by what one would term regulatory strategy, or if you will, an artful way of using the rules, the statutes, the regulations, the policies to navigate an optimal pathway to get a timely review and approval of a compound. Every one is somewhat different, and as you're aware, there are numerous divisions at FDA which look at all sorts of different drug products, and that represents that they do have experts in each of those particular areas, in neurologic diseases, as you're familiar with, or in lung, pulmonary diseases, and so forth. So given that, exactly what does this process entail? What's the throughput, and what does one understand about this? If you see in the upper right under the column listed FDA Review, I've highlighted PDUFA in red. That's near the tail end of a drug process development that begins probably a decade or more before the submission of a compound. And as you see across the top, it takes about 3.5 to sometimes 5 years for preclinical testing in test tubes, in animals, in manufacturing laboratories, and so forth. And then one goes into clinical studies. Phase 1 is the initial exposure to a small number of healthy volunteers, usually, of a new compound to test primarily the safety and how it is processed in the body. And then, presuming success, one proceeds to phase 2 studies where there's probably less than 1,000 patients studied for most drugs to look at both effectiveness and safety. And finally, when a proper dose is determined, then one proceeds to phase 3, which usually, but not with rare diseases, involves several thousand patients. In fact, there were recent new drug applications that have involved up to 10,000 patients in the submissions. The drug industry sponsor is then responsible for compiling all of that information, which frequently ends up in being hundreds of thousands of pages. In fact, the way I like to think of a new drug application in paper, although thank goodness we're saving trees by using electronics more and more, is a 400-page binder on every seat of the Super Bowl stadium that you'll probably be watching 2 weeks from now. That's a lot of paper, and that's a huge submission or equivalent of that for FDA to review. And if you look at the bottom of that slide, the success rate, for every 10,000 compounds approximately that go into a test tube, only about 10 proceed to phase 3 studies, and of those 10, only one makes it to the final FDA review and approval. So that's quite a fall off. The standards are stringent, and that is important, but the elements of benefit and risk, especially in rare diseases, become a very important modifying circumstance. As I already cited for you, moving to the next slide, that studies in phase 3 primarily allow the investigators to look at both the benefits on the left side of the scale and the risks on the right side in very careful detail. And it requires a sufficient enough number of patients, given how many may be available to participate in studies, to make some decisions about what's reasonable or not in terms of its benefit-risk profile. Does it do what folks hoped it would do, and are there manageable risks? As one talks about, then, drugs for rare diseases, typically that's defined through the Orphan Drug Act, and that is defined as being populations with the disease having less than 200,000 patients, and that's in the United States only. There are some important provisions here that allow for additional considerations in making smaller trials possible. And Frank Sasanowski from the National Organization of Rare Disorders, who's currently their board chair, has done a lovely summary of these matters that folks who are really interested in those things may wish to refer to, talking about numerous smaller trials which have been successfully processed by FDA. Then there's some great learning points in there for other companies. So as we proceed, in addition to provisions for rare diseases, there are other things that help expedite the drug development process. There's something called Fast Track, which a industry sponsor may apply for, that is usually restricted to serious diseases and unmet medical needs, which gives the sponsor more access to FDA to help them with study planning. And then further, once one is ready to submit an application, one may proceed with something called accelerated approval, which has endpoints other than irreversible morbidity or survival and can be reasonably measured to the satisfaction of FDA. There are meetings to achieve agreements in these areas that occur prior to one conducting those studies, but this does make things move faster. And one of the new developments that has allowed more expedited processing in trials are the use of patient and parent-reported outcomes, or in some cases, not just parents but caregivers, as with Alzheimer's disease and so forth, where very rigorous development and design is necessary, but it's certainly less challenging to do than long-term studies. And this is an area for rare diseases which may represent a significant opportunity. So once a company takes advantage of all of the preceding things we've discussed, and they have successful trials, they can then proceed to a submission to FDA. And when a drug candidate application is submitted to FDA, within the first 60 days, FDA makes a decision on whether something is a priority status or a standard status, and it makes a difference in about 4 months of how rapidly that would be reviewed. If it's something that is a major advancement in treatment and nothing is available, the target is for a 6-month review goal. So compare that to what I mentioned previously, about 3 to 5 years for an FDA review, and this has been a significant improvement, and FDA is to be applauded for that. And even a standard review moves at warp speed compared to what some of us were experienced with in the past. Once an application goes to FDA with these hundreds of thousands of pages, there is an actual proscriptive process. I don't intend to go through all of these things in detail, but I do realize that the rare disorders community is very attuned to some of the issues that have occurred with applications, such as a refusal to file, which occurs very early. I just went through the rating of priority versus standard, and then the period of review, which then leads to a series of potential actions. And you're probably looking at that illustration on the right of all those wires which says, please do not touch any of these wires. It sometimes seems that complex. That's actually from an IT service center in Mumbai, I'm told. So it probably is representative of complexities that we need to make much better. Again, an opportunity in PDUFA-5. So we've talked about the rules. We've talked about the process. Let's talk about the people a little bit. Who are these regulators and what do they do? Are they just umpires or can they be actual collaborators? And just to give you a little introduction to them, and I've had the pleasure of working with a number of them for over 20 years in a career in industry and in providing advocacy during prior PDUFAs. They're mostly clinical scientists, either physicians or pharmacists. None of them see themselves as bureaucrats, but they are very politically aware because they sometimes get called before congressional committees. And speaking from personal experience, that is not always an enjoyable task. They hate surprises, as most of us do, and they prefer to be part of solutions rather than problems. But when there are safety issues that are glossed over, problems with compliance and so forth, FDA becomes very inflexible, and that is just the behavior that one sees. And importantly, they have no responsibility for commercial or company survival issues, and that's something that is sometimes frequently misunderstood. So what is in the mind of a regulator? Dr. John Jenkins heads the Office of New Drugs at the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and he actually presented at a conference in December and was kind enough to share his slide. But that's what's on the mind of a regulator when they're considering an application. And if you notice a lot of the blue balloons, it's all about safety right now because they're talking about serious adverse events, adverse event incidents, risk management, and so forth. So it's important to be attuned to what is of concern to the agency. And there are other additional emerging issues and evolving trends at FDA that are important to understand. For example, there have been reorganizations where there are now new super offices, if you will, for safety and for compliance. Unfortunately, there is no new super office for benefit, hence the imbalance, if you will, that raises concerns. And visible enforcement has been an important agenda point of the current commissioner and her staff, which we'll see. So what is the distinction I was trying to make between safety and risk? If you look at the font of all knowledge, which is, of course, Wikipedia on our laptops, it describes safety as a condition of being protected against failure, damage, and so forth. And that implies a feeling of security and certainty, which I don't believe we're talking about with drugs or biologics because they are powerful chemicals that are being used because something serious is amiss in a patient. So that is why the distinction between safety and risk is very important. There are a number of safety advocacy organizations who are concerned about drug safety and ideally making drugs free of all harms. That's probably not plausible, and that's why the importance of benefit risk, because you all are thinking of some risks are tolerable if it can give the necessary therapeutic effect for myself, my child, and so forth. And I'm just juxtaposing the safety definition with something from a book by Edward Tenner. Any technology powerful enough to improve life radically is also capable of abuse and prone to serious unanticipated side effects. Mixing new technologies with wide variations in how organizations and individuals behave, and you often have a recipe for explosion. He was not writing about drugs. He was writing about nuclear power. But the analogy holds. These powerful chemicals have their upsides and downsides, and therefore understanding them is absolutely key. And in order to understand the safety issues, OSE here at FDA stands for the Office of Safety and Epidemiology, which I've already mentioned. but also the importance of an advisory committee process, which I would think any new application for a rare disorder would pass through. These are panels of experts external to FDA who are responsible for helping with the review and discussion of new applications to best understand how to balance benefit and risk from the practice community. And that advice is then used by FDA in their deliberations. But FDA is not bound to accept the advice or the votes of the committees that they have in advisory capacity. So let's talk about tipping points, if you will. If you're a fan of Malcolm Gladwell's book on tipping points about sociological events, why did hush puppies come back into being as popular shoes and so forth, there are some analogies in terms of regulatory tipping points as well that are worth discussing. First thing, why would anyone want to rediscuss matters if they're going well? And as you probably read into what I discussed when we talked about 10,000 compounds in a test tube to one coming to patients, why are there such high failure rates? And this is in trials at every stage. Probably are they related to a number of these factors, which came out of a clinical research meeting at Duke several years ago. We probably don't understand as much as we need to about the biology of most diseases, including DMD, as you're aware from some of the hypotheses on axon skipping and so forth. It's also possible that trials have not been well designed, so people didn't find the right dose. It could have been a drug that worked, but because of the design of the trial, its effect was not properly detected. Or maybe the detection systems like biomarkers, blood tests that may indicate how a drug is acting were insufficient. Or someone did a trial, as you see in the fourth subpoint, where FDA and the drug sponsor did not have a clear agreement on how things were going to be gauged. That unfortunately happens. And finally, as you'll see, lack of sufficient drug development capital. Although for those of you who read Bloomberg this morning, you were probably very lifted up to see that much more capital from the venture community is now being devoted to rare diseases. And there was a nice article about BioMarin in achondroplasia studies that was published. Well, so take heart. There are some very positive things coming forward. And I'm just going to highlight here not all the points. I respect it's a very busy slide, but what I'd like to highlight for you is that just in the last 20 years, from 1990 up through now, 2010, 2012, there have been dramatic changes in science, in sociologic outlooks, in the technology we have, such as information technology, in the changes in policies and so forth that drive the need to adapt and to have change at FDA and in the drug development community. We can come back to these things if you have questions, but I want to be sure that we touch on all the key points. So in aggregate, as science changes, as technology changes, what does that next lead us to? And what do we assume going forward? Well, at least in the United States, healthcare cost containment will expand and will probably impact innovation. We're going to do lots better with electronic exchange of information. Thirdly, that patients, payers, and consumers will become even more involved in care decisions. That's very good news. And finally, the not-so-good news, regulators continue to focus on safety issues out of proportion to benefit, expand enforcement, and so forth. The somewhat whimsical ad you see there on the right is actually from less than 50 years ago. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarettes. Seems like totally absurd now, but in the post-World War II era, we knew a lot less about what caused lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and so forth. The more we learn, the more we need to change, and that's clearly representative of the drug development environment as well. So the prevalence of diseases are changing. And if you looked at information from the World Health Organization, the things that make people sick worldwide are very different in terms of prevalence in 1990 versus 2010, in part because of vaccinations in the third world and other advances, but there are also a lot better drugs available now than there were 20 years ago for some, but as you're aware, not for all diseases. So it's good for us to revisit what we're doing and why, and what drives these changes in drug development. Well, one is trust, another is key tipping points, and a third is changing rules, or GXPs, good development practices, which I'll go through only briefly each. There are very interesting studies on the importance of trust, and it does influence hugely how the public perceives risks, not just about drugs, but about nuclear power and anything else in our surrounding environment. When there's a state of high public trust, regulators have incredible latitude and innovation flourishes. However, when there is low public trust and a high perceived risk, as in unsafe drugs, if you will, there are political micromanagement of the regulators. They get called to see their congressional masters frequently, and they get very risk averse. And that is further catalyzed by the legal environment as well. Since I have a son who's a lawyer, I can't speak too fervently against this, but clearly when issues occur such as with Vioxx, there's a lot in the newspapers. The public gets concerned. They wonder about more regulation, and Congress, FDA, and others are probably listening. And unfortunately, that is the state of affairs that FDA has now described in the bottom bullet, that FDA has stated publicly they feel that for drug approvals, a social contract on safety has changed, which is interpreted by them to mean that it's much better to delay approvals until you know all about the safety profile of a new drug before proceeding, because safety is more important than benefit. That may or may not be fair. There may be some exceptions, but that is a perception that has to be addressed. And it is a tipping point that is similar to some prior ones as it related to events in the environment, some positive, but mostly negative, as with Vioxx, as you may recall, being associated with cardiovascular disease and subsequently being withdrawn from the market. So I mentioned trust, and I mentioned tipping points there, things that tend to have a profound effect with just one incident. And then there's the rules. The rules have been changing. There are rules that FDA enforces on drug development, all of which begin with G for good. And there's good laboratory practices, GLPs, good clinical practices, GCPs. The upshoot being there's kind of a checklist that the regulators have. And if those checklists are not properly adhered to in how drug studies are performed, enforcement actions occur. And the enforcement has been a huge initiative for FDA. And I would believe at least a tripling in the number of enforcement actions against industry, investigators, and others. That sometimes has a very chilling effect on the conduct of studies. And additional challenges here relate to the balance of benefit risk pre-approval versus post-approval and what level of tolerance one may have. As you see in the third sub-point under that first major dark text, a more systematic framework could facilitate regulatory decision-making through a product's life cycle, giving allowances for rare versus common diseases. I think benefit risk for rare diseases is an important leverage point in PDUFA and as one works with FDA going forward. And also the importance of enhancing communication between FDA and industry, and importantly, for your purposes, how patient and parent input in these processes can be built in and then improved. So just a few comments about benefit risk. FDA has been moving in a somewhat plodding fashion towards a better framework for how they make these decisions across drug compounds. And across their 16 review divisions, there is no consistent pattern for the determination of benefit versus risk. So FDA is entering into some pilot programs whereby one will be looking at severity of conditions, whether the need is unmet or not, and then looking at clinical benefit, clinical risk, and then risk management. Can the risks be mitigated, if you will, by things such as training programs for prescribers or patients and so forth? That's a step in the right direction. And as you see in the next slide, there's actually some additional pilots that have been built on through the pharmaceutical industry and also through regulators in other countries that may help FDA move forward. And it talks about, under key design principles there, how to better facilitate communications. That means gathering better input from patients, from parents, from caregivers, and so forth, to be able to better depict benefit risk, especially when patient outcomes are the key measurable as opposed to something you can do with a blood test. And as one looks at a final depiction of benefit and risk, there are important factors in the right-hand box talking about evidence and uncertainties that are important. For rare diseases, I think we'd all agree that less evidence is better given the rarity of the conditions, and that some uncertainties are tolerated where in other disease states, which are more common and frequent, they would not be so tolerated. So where are we right now, and where should we be going? The status of drug development overall in aggregate is that there's a slowdown in the review and approval process because of the focus on safety. There are increased drug development costs, and that tends to slow things down as well. And that as there are more enforcement actions and larger citations about safety issues in a product label, at what point do we no longer just inform patients and parents, but actually begin to frighten them unduly? And what other issues might exist that we need to be aware of as we think about building them into our advocacy practices? Well, there's more complexity in terms of the kinds of things FDA is looking at that they never looked at before. Metabolic pathways, special populations here, and what is the lowest effective dose? In many ways, these are scientifically good, but they may or may not play into timely studies for rare diseases and something that needs to be carefully managed. And then next level concerns about risk and benefit. And I think it's an important advocacy point to be able to bring to FDA and others the importance of tolerable risk in the rare diseases community. This will be an important discussion point in PDUFA. And that leads us to the concluding pieces here of our discussion. What are the ways forward in seeking advocacy, balanced benefit-risk approaches, and rare disease improvements? Well, PDUFA is so-called must-pass legislation. The government would like to get the approximately $3 billion, which is estimated to be paid in. And as a result of must-pass legislation, folks like to term it a Christmas tree. And everybody wants to hang a new ornament on their Christmas tree. This is the Christmas tree from PDUFA-IV. Lots of things happened at that point. You see the PDUFA star at the top, and there were many, many things that did get hung on that tree in terms of additional provisions. There were also a number of things that went back in the ornament box, as you see there on the right. And without going into the details, I'd be willing to wager that with this PDUFA, there will be many constituencies for rare diseases and otherwise, for the industry, for other groups that will be advocating major changes. Some will get hung on the PDUFA tree, others will go back in the box. But the importance of having clear, concise advocacy positions in these situations are key. And the timeline is fairly short, but with many opportunities coming forward. This is the timeline for the user fee acts to be moving through Congress. Hearings on PDUFA actually begin 2 weeks from now, and they will proceed up through the end of September, when FDA will have to fire staff unless this is renewed. That's likely not to happen, which is why it's called must-pass legislation. And we would anticipate over the next 4 to 5 months multiple opportunities where groups such as PPMD may be able to provide sage counsel to those who are considering changes. Now, the PDUFA-5 already has a draft profile that industry and FDA were charged with developing. And there is a plank in the platform for development of drugs with rare diseases that FDA and the industry acknowledge issues in this area, and that recent trends in orphan designations indicate that there will be increasing attention to these areas. So FDA is proposing that if PDUFA is approved in its current form, that there will be new guidances for advancing and facilitating development for rare diseases, increased outreach to the patient and industry groups as to how better to improve the development processes. They will convene a public meeting or meetings to gain more input on complex issues, on trial design from investigators, on patient-reported outcome from parents and patients, to develop training for their review staff, and to review drugs for rare diseases in a much more rare disease-oriented pattern. There is no training right now for various parties in the review divisions. So this is all good news. And the question is it enough? And that's a question that will be facing all of you as you think about your policy positions. And you will not be the only ones. There are a number of legislative proposals that are now either entered or circulated, which are talking about ways to facilitate rare disorder, drug development, or similar areas, including things such as expedited approvals, although that appears not to be as popular this week as last. Without going through all of these, the Ultra-Orphan Act is proposed to be even more provisions for those rare disorders that have less than, I believe it's 6,000 patients in the United States for that entity. So there's going to be lots of competing considerations. And whether these or anything else will be added to PDUFA-5 is a question of whether the proposal has wings, whether the wings flap, and whether it flies. In other words, how will it compete with the proposals from other constituencies? And it's not just rare diseases that are offered as an addition. There are a number of other modifications. There will be pilots for benefit risk, new risk management practices, and so forth. The interface of all these, to me, represents a real opportunity for PPMD and others, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to talk about those matters going forward. So in order to look at the potential actions that you might consider in balancing benefit and risk, as you see in the red letters on the right, regulatory reform, practice reform, advocacy for policy change are all potential interventions to move the levers on things such as the number of patients required in trials and so forth. Multiple opportunities mean multiple chances to have interface with the people that make policy. So to conclude, so that we have a few minutes for questions as well, and I am available beyond 2 o'clock if we have discussion beyond that. I'm sure Pat will have some other comments as well. I would just conclude by saying excellence in drug development is founded on the notion that patient needs must be the true north, number one, that one must engage regulators as part of the solution, that one must anticipate what kinds of issues may arise to best address them with appropriate contingency plans, and by understanding what drives change, one may anticipate what policy changes are needed. Data drives change, exceptions, that is, safety exceptions drive change, politics drive change. Understanding that, being able to speak to the politicians about the data are key. So drug development is complex, but it's not unnavigable. We're going to see more in terms of development with knowledge and technology, better science, better ways to manufacture drugs and test their quality. And we're also learning a lot about how to minimize risk by pre-selecting populations for treatments with certain drugs. And those are all very key. But to go to the final slide, the summary points are, hope that this gave you the kinds of background on FDA processes to at least get an idea of who's involved, what kind of pace it takes, what kinds of issues may gum up the works, if you will, and thereby provide you clear understanding of how you may wish to develop policies for advocacy and how to engage in those areas, how to build more evidence about benefit risk, about rare disease patient-reported outcomes and so forth, to really bolster your toolbox for interacting with the policymakers and the regulators. And again, I would applaud PPMD for seizing this opportunity for leadership in terms of the kinds of policy developments and interfaces with the decision makers going forward, and doing so by offering potential solutions, not just saying it's not working, and by developing the right kind of allies. So I will stop there. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you, and I look forward to questions that you might have. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tim. That was absolutely wonderful, and I hope our audience and all the rest of the audiences that will listen to the podcast will learn and benefit by this. As Tim mentioned, we, PPMD, under the guidance of many people, and primarily FAGRA B and D, developed a policy, and the reason it's not out there at the moment is because we vetted it with National Organization of Rare Disease as well as Genetic Alliance. And the reason for that was because there are so many conversations happening, we really wanted to investigate what kinds of support we would have going forward, because as Tim mentioned, there are going to be some pilots that are going to be done, and we'd like to position Duchenne as really one of the lead rare conditions that is faced with all of these issues with regard to benefit risk, with regard to proving efficacy, and I think all of us recognize that because there's such a negative trajectory here, doing nothing is doing harm. So, Tim, I wonder if you would, and so we are going to open up for questions, but I'm going to ask one question. Some of the things that are tossed around are compassionate use, conditional approval, access programs. Could you just give a few words on conditional approval, what that means if the regulatory agencies use it in the United States, and how they have or when they have an access program, and how that relates to compassionate use? Because so many times as drugs go into trial, as you know, it's for a very specific cohort of individuals, and so many times, especially boys that are not walking, are left out of the equation in trials. So the thought is, how and under what circumstances might we be able to include them? So I know that's a lot of questions wrapped up into one, but I'd love you to address some of the access ways as well as this conditional approval topic.
Great questions, Pat, and I'll discuss it in two parts. The first relating to compassionate use, and there's certainly a number of varieties of that. One can have a compassionate use program, which is running at the same time as a phase 3 late phase study, or it may be compassionate use after a patient completes participation in a trial. Frequently is company dependent, and especially in rare diseases, one of the challenges is if one expands compassionate use programs, does it actually delay in the conduct of the studies to either prove or disprove that a drug is working? So a lot of companies wrestle with that. I don't know that there's any clear-cut trend in industry. I've seen some folks be very embracing the patient communities in that regard, and others conversely saying we can't do this because we think we just can't survive as a company without moving expeditiously to approval. So it does take time and effort. I'm hopeful that the more companies understand the rare disease communities, the more that they will provide latitude for that. On the flip side, a conditional approval would mean presuming all the studies are done and fine. Then what occurs in the European Union is, in fact, the possibility for less than a full approval. And I would suspect that what would happen in the U.S. if some of the current proposals are approved for rare diseases and otherwise, a conditional approval means a company is allowed to put a new compound on the market for a 1-year period. And there are stringent assessments and studies that need to be done. Sometimes patients have to be registered in those studies and cannot get drug without it. And then at the end of the year, or whatever period of time is agreed, the FDA would then review and say it either meets what your initial study suggested or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, the drug would be withdrawn from the market, which is obviously very disruptive to patient communities and so forth. So those are just two different programs that are being discussed, and how much you can expedite things for a conditional approval is kind of a recipe making. It's not as well defined as folks would like.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a question here, Tim, and this talks about how as an advocacy group do we interact with our representatives, and I know that most of the legislation is under a certain committee before it goes to vote. Are there specific individuals on the Hill that we need to speak with? How would you see this going forward?
You bet. That's a great one. And as PPMD decides on how they wish to proceed with interactions, there are certainly fast-track pathways, if you will, and the committees of jurisdiction, for example, for FDA matters are under the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the Subcommittee on Health, and at least for the last three PDUFAs, that's been where a lot of the arm wrestling has gone on. And on the Senate side, the Senate Health Committee. So those are important groups, and we would be able to provide certainly the names and contacts of individuals. There are really some exceptional Hill staff with whom folks may work to understand how they can bring their opinions to bear and what kind of concerns those drafting committees have. So, fortunately, when I was responsible for the pharmaceutical industry's PDUFA-II program in clinical, my counterpart was Vince Ventimiglia, who's now one of our partners at FBD. So I guess it's a good lesson to be nice to the folks you work with going up.
I think that's always the lesson. As PPMD has developed this policy, and as we look at that policy and share that policy with the community, which we intend to do in the next week or so, I think that one of the ways we have been successful in the past is to develop key talking points that we've agreed on as a community, and repeating those 3 or 4 talking points over and over to the committees of jurisdiction. I think that seems like the most successful approach, rather than each of us having an opinion and going in with 25 opinions. Would you agree with that?
Totally agree. And I've heard folks say, if you got caught on an elevator with President Obama, what would you use that 15, 20 seconds for? So having your elevator speech with the key points and everybody saying basically the same thing, it can have a powerful amplifying effect. Totally with you.
Thank you. And I think there has been conversation over time about going to meet as individuals with the FDA and talking about an individual's experience in a trial or their opinion about a certain strategy. And I've heard various examples, as the AIDS community is always tossed up about. Well, the AIDS community has been able to get combined therapies and approvals quite quickly. Is the same model available today in the same way that the AIDS community has taken this forward?
I wish it were. I think the environment has changed, and I think the AIDS advocacy groups were quite fortunate in the time frame they were in, because there was a much more interactive attitude at FDA. I think at this point in time, it's much more difficult to get audiences than in the past, because FDA feels they don't have enough staff to deal with anything other than their core mission. But that said, I think a way to approach this is by bringing not only individual experiences, but something more in aggregate. So patients within a community having some kind of surveys or data or things that would inform FDA and help them understand the community beyond individual stories. Not that the individual stories aren't important, but it's hard for them to integrate with everything else.
Right. Another problem that the community has at the moment are the outcomes. Right. I think in the AIDS community they use death as an outcome, which is certainly an easier diagnosis than slight or greater decline. We've used the 6-minute walk test, which is now being correlated with other motor function, but it's very difficult with a negative trajectory disease that is very hard to sort of pick the exact cohort of boys at the exact time that if they don't decline or if they in fact improve, that's the point at which you'll have enough evidence because there's such clinical variability. And we have no biomarkers as well. We are trying to develop one with the first one that may come online is the MRI and muscle that's being done at 3 sites, Florida, Oregon, and Philadelphia. So I guess in that, do you have any wisdom about that, Tim, of how we might go forward? I know we are working with various groups on outcomes, but gosh, I think every parent could probably tell you a change in their son over time, right? And probably much more sensitively than any test will provide. And this is where I always think about a composite score. If we were measuring 5 different or 10 different measures in our children, and if they had, for instance, 5 of those 10 increased or 5 of those 10 stayed the same, it would seem that we'd be able to address that clinical variability issue.
Pat, it's a great point, and I've heard you speak before about the importance of time with the children earlier as having high quality and as later, just being difficult care situations. Not that that isn't important. How can one prolong that best time going forward? And that then demands better composite score measures to help one look at the variability across a group of boys in this instance and how one can better measure that. There are a few examples where that has worked in other disease states. And I think we need to look at it.
Would it be interesting, or do you suppose possible with regard to industry, to recommend a composite score on the patient-reported outcomes as potentially a surrogate, obviously, that we would like to validate for a primary outcome?
I think that would be tremendous, and working not only with industry, but perhaps with interested parties at FDA and at NIH might be interesting paths moving forward.
And would you just say, and I know we're a little bit over, Tim, so unless anyone else has questions, I'll ask my final question, and that is benefit risk. I think this risk-benefit analysis is difficult because I hear in many conversations, well, I have another question to follow as well, in many conversations that parents will say, I'm willing to risk more, and for even less benefit if we could just hold my son where he is. And I'm willing to risk, right, or carry greater risk. I think this is a really nebulous term and very hard to get to because I worry that we'd be in a circumstance where someone from regulatory or industry or elsewhere might say to us, what are you willing to risk? And are there good ways to capture that benefit-risk scenario and equation in rare disease?
I think that's a process in evolution. And I think the importance of these kind of discussions is it gets folks thinking about, well, what would I want to measure? And what would be acceptable for me to be included in some kind of composite measure? And it has to be way more than 6-minute walking tests. Is it certain activities at school? Is it certain interactions at home? I don't think we've seen the progress there that we'd like to. But I think these are exactly the kind of discussions that catalyze those next steps.
And also, could we include in that the caregiver burden? Because I think as parents and primary caregivers, if this child sleeps all night, for instance, then the primary caregiver sleeps all night, and the family is generally, I'm making the assumption, but if everyone sleeps all night, it seems like the day goes much, much better than if everyone's up every few minutes. So as we look at composite scores, we could develop a very broad score in terms of composite.
Absolutely, and I think the Alzheimer's community for caregivers has really developed some very thoughtful tools, not that they apply directly at all, but the kinds of things that they look at in measuring may be applicable or worthy of at least looking at. So I think those are all very appropriate opportunities for intervention.
And one other question about flexibility. I think that in public forums, I've heard Drs. Temple and others talk about their flexibility, but it seems like the flexibility is suggested, but when you come to the division level, that there seems to be less willingness for flexibility. Could you just make a comment on that?
I think that's a very fair observation. I think that the policy folks would like to be able to accommodate, but when the rubber hits the road, there's always something that a division director or reviewer will bring up that may slow things up. So, flexibility is nice. They look like Gumby up at the upper levels and much more like Iron Man at the lower. So it's really challenging. I think these PDUFA things are an opportunity to help push these things down by encouragement of management incenting more flexibility at the division level.
Thank you. And we have one final question, and I think this is always on all of our hearts and minds, right? And that is, as these trials take years to really develop and then execute, analyze, and then submit the NDA or the new drug application to the FDA, there are years of time that are involved in that process. And your son may or may not fit into that cohort that is testing the new drug or the new biologic. In the meantime, you have this whole circle of young men who potentially could benefit but are excluded based on they don't meet the inclusion criteria, and so they're waiting and waiting and waiting. And I guess some of that is really has to do with our advocacy agenda. We really need to address these issues now and try to see if we can create new models for trials that would be inclusive. One of the things that we've talked about internally is having a trial or to be able, not us conducting the trial, of course, but if industry would conduct a trial and agree to the fact that once the trial was fully recruited, they would have an open label safety trial for others who don't fit the inclusion criteria of the, for instance, pivotal trial, but fit the criteria for which the drug was being developed. Have you ever seen a model such as that?
I have seen it proposed. I'm not sure I've seen FDA embrace that, but I think now is the time to think of that. I've seen the chat comments from Allison and Bob both, which kind of allude to this as well, that there's a lot of lost time and boys in these periods. How can we better expedite things? And I do think that moving forward with these kind of considerations in the PDUFA-5 process is one, but not the only way to help proceed ahead. I think by meeting with FDA and acquainting them with data and concerns beyond individual case considerations, it can be a compelling way to approach things. And I always keep remembering the Shawshank Redemption as a great movie in terms of a model for persistence. I think having that kind of longitudinal plan for staying on the case of the regulators and the legislators is very important.
Yes, I am a fan of the Shawshank Redemption. I love it where it is get busy living or get busy dying, and I think for our sons we want to get them busy living. So I thank you, Tim, for this. Again, the PPMD board has developed a policy that will be shared and a strategy behind it that will be shared in the next week or so with the community. So thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you especially to Tim. This has been really wonderful and the first of hopefully many conversations with you. Thank you.
Great. Take care, all. I admire what you're doing.
Thank you.